Hello, BookTube. How was your reading summer? I had a good reading summer myself. I liked the books I read. I read about 17 books, and I've just kind of been wanting to talk about it because I've been thinking about how many books I read over this past summer, and just thought it would be fun to do a little lightning round. I have a photograph of all the pictures that I read this summer laid out on a table, and I just thought it'd be fun to go through them left to right, top to bottom, spend about a minute and a half each on them. I already tried doing this video, but I kind of lost myself in the explanation. And on my first book, the timer went up before I even said anything about it. So this time, hopefully I'll be a little bit more concise and snappy with the video because I don't want it to be too long. I don't want to do 17 separate episodes and put them into one. Some of these books I might do episodes on down the line, but for now, let's just get into it. So let me pull my picture up here and screen share it. There we go. Nice spread of books here. You might be recognizing a few already. You might not. Yeah, none of these are really popular. You're probably not. But let's start with the first book, Lilith by George Macdonald. Let's go, start timer. So this is a book by George Macdonald, who's a fantasy writer, one of the earliest fantasy writers. If you like modern fantasy, everything's about world building and strict rules. Everything's very anal, but this is part of a genre. I don't know if it was really a genre. I don't know if there's a term for it, but I call it the dreamscape fantasy, where it's more allegorical than anything. The character is usually a blank slate, moves around this dreamlike fairy world where things change before their very eyes and nothing's really as it seems. And this is that kind of book, but this was clearly an inspiration for The Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe. Definitely a predecessor to that, and it's very, very interesting. This goes along with Fantastes, his other book he wrote that was sort of the same style. It's not a sequel or prequel. It's just sort of it feels like a counterpart to it, like a brother and sister book. This one's very dark and includes the themes of death and even some children being killed during the path of the story. It's rather grim, but it's very beautiful in that way. There's a lot of beautiful things that happen with the death aspect of it. There's a bit of death and rebirth in there. The ultimate message, of course, is that death is fine. It's a very Christian book. And of course, Lilith in the title refers to the mythological Christian deity of Lilith, who is Adam's first wife or something like that. And she's the villain of the book, and she's actually amazing in it. She's a pretty interesting character. All right. I went a little over time there, but that's okay. The second book is The Spy by James Fenimore Cooper, starting the timer now. And this book is sort of like his Leatherstocking Tales, structure-wise. It usually takes place over a course of a few days in just one location. And there's a lot of characters in this one. There's a lot of people that you have to keep track of. But that kind of has to be by necessity because this book concerns a lot of the character relationships are important in this book because it's about the American Revolution and about the split loyalties and all the allegories that happen therein. And James Fenimore Cooper was important for being one of the first really American authors. And this book is one of the more important that he's written because it's actually the first book about the American Revolution, the first novel about the American Revolution. I thought it was quite good. It's very, it's very long. It might be a bit of a challenge to read, but it feels very patriotic by the end in a way that makes you feel good about yourself. And I just like the way James Fenimore Cooper does morality in his books. It's very romanticized, obviously, but he has a lot of interesting character relationships and interesting split loyalties that are always add flavor to the old-timey feel of his adventures. And this one, I think, is one of his classics. It's next to the Leatherstocking Tales for interest. Now, this next one is also by James Fenimore Cooper, and it's called Wyandotte. Let's start in timer. Now, this book is about a colony of people that set themselves up in the middle of the early United States on a knoll. They call it the Hutted Knoll. And it's just sort of the story of their colony and how it thrives through the ages and its eventual downfall. But most of the book is rather boring. Most of the book is just characters talking about nothing amazing in particular, sort of talking about things happen, plot sort of happens, but it also feels like James should really get a move on, or at least make it more interesting for the reader. The most interesting part of the book is Saucy Nick, a Wyandotte chief, the Wyandotte of the title, and he has a split loyalty, as I mentioned with the spy. The main man in the book, he hates him because this guy was a former captain who used to beat him. So, and yet he's working for him to fend off the invaders that eventually come to the knoll. But by the end of the book, he has his revenge. He kills this man, and then he goes back to his daughters and tells the daughters that the enemy killed him. So he sort of creates his own solution. He has his own morality, which is a very noble, savage thing. Hold on, the timer's about to end. Which is a very noble, savage thing to do. And I lost my train of thought. Well, it's very representative of the noble savage, and that he has his own code of morality, which isn't quite like the white people's, or what is alleged to be the white people's, nor is it treated as very equal or superior to it. But the way he makes his own solution, I find it very interesting, and I think he's definitely the best character in the book, and he's what makes the book. Without him, the book would be boring, and the book is without him for most of it, so the book mostly is boring, but it has that one nugget of like real interest in there that really helps it along. The ending, I thought, I didn't like the ending because it kind of negated what I just said I liked about it, but I just ignored that. Anyway, the next book is Mr. Midshipman Easy by Captain Marryat. Now, this is an interesting book if you don't like equality. Anyway, the 1800s definition of equality, which wasn't really racial at all. This is a book about a philosopher, which is a condemned profession by Marryat, who fathers a son that he teaches equality, and this son just grows up to be a real brat because he thinks he's entitled to all these things that other people are entitled to, and he doesn't know how to work his own way. So he decides to go off to sea, thinking that since there's no land or property boundaries and everybody's in the same boat, literally, that it would be an equality haven. But no, obviously he is very gravely mistaken, and he is soon beat by his superiors and totally beaten to submission, and he has to learn to work his own way. But it's a little strange the way the book handles it, because he's still very independent, and he's very, he talks back to his masters and he doesn't care about them. And at the same time, that's also what makes him so great. By the end of the book, he becomes a commodore or something, or a captain, and that was because he denied his leaders. But he also learns to believe that equality is bogus. So it's a great adventure story, though. This next book is called The Sphinx of the Ice Realm by Jules Verne, but it's actually two books in one. It's the narrative of Arthur Gordon Pym by Edgar Allan Poe, and then The Sphinx of the Ice Realm by Jules Verne, which is a sequel to that. I read the narrative of Arthur Gordon Pym, so that's what I'm going to be talking about right now. I'll probably read The Sphinx of the Ice Realm sometime, but I don't know. Starting timer now. So the narrative of Arthur Gordon Pym is about a man who gets on a boat and goes off to sea because he wants to have an adventure in the 1700s, and the boat gets mutineered and pirates take it over, and then they get rid of the pirates, and then the ship drifts for a while and there's cannibalism and it's like this horrible gothic narrative. And then eventually they crash land on an island where there's a bunch of weird natives and strange plants, and it's all very odd. And then by the end, there's this cool ending. I don't want to give it away, but it is an interesting work by Edgar Allan Poe. It's one of those works where I like thinking about it. I just think it's cool. And that's basically all it has. It's not much of it is really, it's not a masterpiece. It's definitely sort of a piece of pulp from before pulps existed, and sort of lends credence to the idea that the Gothic stories are like pulps before there were pulps. So that's what I think about that story. There, maybe it goes a little bit too far about with the Gothic elements sometimes. Like at one point, there's just a ghost ship full of dead people that like drifts past their ship and drifts away, and it's literally never explained. You never find out what it is, who those people were, anything about it, why there's randomly a ghost ship full of dead people. That part I found a little annoying. So next up is not a book, but a collection of short stories, which is almost 500 pages long. This is a huge, huge collection. And it also contains the novella The Brick Moon, which I might just talk about on its own someday. But I'm just going to do a really quick overview right now. This is a really great collection of stories of like pre-science fiction and early science fiction stories. It's more proto-science fiction. It's so proto-science fiction that a lot of these stories aren't even identifiable as science fiction. It's mostly just weird tales and speculative fiction and that kind of thing. But as you can see on the cover, it says from 1650 to 1935. So there's a long range of stories here, but it's very fascinating. A lot of these stories you don't find anywhere else, or you don't find in many other places. Like one story I particularly liked was The Wonder Maker. Another I liked was the Brick Moon, The People of the Pit by Abraham Marryat. It also has The Color Out of Space, which is the only story in here that's like really popular, I think. Some other stories are just kind of boring, like System by Carol Chapek and the Los Amigos Fiasco by Arthur Conan Doyle. There's also a story by H.G. Wells called The Country of the Blind, which I really liked. And this collection is a little rare, but I really enjoyed it. Even though it's like 550 pages, I just ended up gobbling up the whole thing. And it even includes like a chapter from Olaf Stapledon's Last and First Men, which is actually the book that I'm currently reading right now. And it's a very good collection. Next story is The Best Martin Hewitt Detective Novels by Arthur Morrison. I found this book at a local used bookstore, and here's a little thing about me. I love Dover editions. Whenever I see a book that I don't even think I would like to or care to read it, I pick it up because it's a Dover edition. It's just a little like fetishization that I have. And this is one case of that. I don't really read mysteries. I read Sherlock Holmes, and this is kind of like Sherlock Holmes. It's from like the same time period, but I picked it up mostly because it was this nice Dover edition that looks really nice and has facsimile, like double column format on the inside, which I love, and illustrations, which I'm very happy about. Dover edition and double column format with illustrations, like facsimile from the old Strand magazines from the 1800s, is like guaranteed purchase for me almost every time. Now let's start the timer. This book is it's a collection of Martin Hewitt detective stories, which was a contemporary of Sherlock Holmes. I think he was actually in the Strand magazine along with Sherlock Holmes. When Arthur Conan Doyle wasn't writing Sherlock Holmes, Martin Hewitt was filling his place. And he's actually sort of equal to Sherlock Holmes in quality, to be honest. He's not second rate at all. There's a little bit of the rule of opposites with him. He's not exactly like Sherlock Holmes. He's a good detective, but he's like short, a little bit fatter. He's a little nicer. It's definitely like Sherlock Holmes, but not like Sherlock Holmes. A lot of these stories have great situations in them. Like I can actually remember what a lot of these stories are about just because each one of them is notable. Like there's the one about the torpedo. There's the one about the musical notes that they have to decipher. There's the one about the tabernacle and the weird cult. They're all about something very specific. It isn't just like a murder and an interesting way that it's solved. So these are actually a little more memorable to me than the Sherlock Holmes mysteries are, because in Sherlock Holmes there's a lot of like random murders and maybe they're in interesting locations, but they're generally kind of realistic. Here, every story is memorable. And I'd actually highly recommend this book. If you're into detective stories, especially detective stories from the 1800s, if you want more Sherlock Holmes, you should definitely read this. There's more Martin Hewitt stories out there. Dover hasn't republished them. I don't know why they don't make an edition that's just more Martin Hewitt detective stories. I mean, they still publish this book. You can still buy it from their website. So I don't know why they haven't done that. Especially because in the introduction, E.F. Blyler himself does say all the stories are about the same quality. So it's hard to pick those for this collection. Why not make another one? He hasn't been reprinted since 1890, whatever. Absolutely shameful. I'm definitely going to want to read more of these, but I'll just have to find them first. I might have to get them for free. Anyway, next story is The Song of Arthur, which I found on the same bookstore trip as Martin Hewitt Detective Stories, and I picked it up because it's a bunch of King Arthur stories. Now, this story is like a bunch of King Arthur stories. Some are real, some are not. They're all rewritten by John Matthews. Some of them are like taken from real sources, and other ones he just made up, and it's a bit of a mishmash. Like, I have mixed feelings about this. Some of these stories, I picked it up because I like Arthuriana, and I just wanted to read it because I thought that there were some stories in here I hadn't read yet, but of course, I'm not quite sure what's real and what's not. Like, there's one story he wrote about a woman who disguises herself as a man, and it's narrated by Merlin, and I kind of like that story. In the story, he's doing a bit of a transgender thing. He's making it into a matter of transgender. This woman, the narrator, which is Merlin, actually says this woman wants to become a man, which I bet you dollars to donuts wasn't how it was portrayed in the original version. Maybe you could interpret it, but it's not a sure thing. And during the story, Merlin is laughing at her because he thinks it's funny. I kind of like the way the author portrays like a trans character, but doesn't make it feel like the whole point of the story is just to validate that character, and actually makes it feel like it's from the time, but at the same time it doesn't turn it into like an anti-trans thing. But that sort of sums up how I feel about this collection. I'm like, I sort of like it, but I also kind of don't know what's really Arthurian and what's not, which maybe is the totally wrong approach for this thing. But I don't know. Perhaps it just wasn't for me. Now, the next story here is one that I'm really interested in. It's The Life and Adventures of Peter Wilkins. I had never heard of this book before until I found it at the John K. King bookstore in Detroit. I love it when this happens, when there's a book just sitting on the shelf and I never knew it existed until I found it on the shelf. And this is one such case. This is a book from about 1750, and it owes its existence to Robinson Crusoe. It's kind of an adventure story. It begins like a Robinsonade, but then it quickly diverges into what is essentially the first, or one of the first, lost race adventure stories. Now, there's tons of stories before this point, like Gulliver's Travels, that you could argue are lost race adventure stories. But in my experience, I think this may be the first that's really like King Solomon's Mines. This guy finds a lost civilization. He explores it. He talks about its manners and its customs, and it's sort of an allegory, but it's also kind of made to feel realistic. It's not absurdism. And he fights a civil war within this lost race, and then he marries a woman, he becomes a king, and it feels very H. Rider Haggard. Now, this book does have some boring parts. There's actually there's actually a huge dramatic mistake where he fights the war and then explores the kingdom. So there's like this big block. So he gets to the kingdom. He spends like 70 pages fighting this war. And then there's like 40 pages discovering the kingdom and like talking about its customs and stuff. And you can definitely see why people like H. Rider Haggard or other Lost Race writers who probably read this book because it was kind of popular when this came out, read that and decided to switch those two around. And that becomes the standard formula for a Lost Race adventure story. So yeah, I thought it was very interesting, but it's definitely more interesting to think about than it is to read, if that makes any sense. Now, the next story is by Jules Verne. It's one of his extant works. It's not 20,000 Leagues Under the Sea or anything like that. It's The Village in the Treetops. Now, this one is good for its description, I think. There's like one idea that makes up this whole book. It's like 150 pages, soaking wet, as they say. It's just about how some people discover some monkeys in deep in Africa that act kind of like human beings, have their own language, do their own stuff. And that's basically all that there is to the story. It feels a little bit like it's an Edgar Allan Poe style, like Gothic narrative, because it actually gets a little scary and sad near the end, which makes sense because Jules Verne read Edgar Allan Poe and was inspired to write because of him. I just wish it went further in that direction. It feels a little stunted. It should have been really scary near the end. It could have been like Heart of Darkness before there was Heart of Darkness. But instead it felt like an adventure novel that was sort of for children. The characters are really simplistic. The description is good. The adventure is fun. But by the end, it's just sort of like, oh, that's it. Okay. You can kind of see why it's not one of his most well-known works. But it is very interesting. I do like reading these Jules Verne books. I actually haven't read his most popular ones, but I've read this one. Isn't that strange? Okay, stopping the timer early. The next one is a book by H. Rider Haggard. It's The Yellow God. And the Yellow God in the title is Mammon, the god of money. And that sounds like an interesting thing because this story sort of has money and greed as its main theme. The main thrust of the story is that the character needs to attain wealth in order to marry this woman whose father doesn't want him to marry her because he's not rich enough. He's like this corrupt businessman kind of thing. And that's why he goes on an expedition to find a treasure. But in order to go on this expedition, he has to wear a mask of gold so that he can convince the natives that he is a god of gold. And I thought that was really interesting because I was wondering, going with the allegory, maybe this means like this represents how he feels like he has to put on this mask of being rich and affluent in his life back in England in order to get what he wants, but it's not really who he is. But that's kind of where the allegory ends. It sort of peters out after a while. It feels like after 150 pages, H. Rider Haggard just like banged it out to get it done and sort of abandoned the allegory, which is really sad because I was very interested in that allegory. The natives have a god that has like a gold face. That's like a snake creature or whatever. But that doesn't really go anywhere. I thought that this god would be literally an incarnation of like Satan. And I thought that would be really cool and scary, but I actually don't know what was going on with that thing by the end of the story. And it didn't really seem to corrupt him that much or seem like a god of gold. Anyway, the next story here is The Insidious Dr. Fu-Manchu, which I read sort of on the recommendation of Sean D. Standfast. He said that it's a very enjoyable pulp adventure, but I didn't really care for it. It just seemed boring. It was like 5 stories in one, and it's definitely a fix-up novel. Stories published separately that just get lumped together, and it really shows. Like it's just a series of racist like short stories. Look, I know racist is like the name of the game. You might be tempted to think that this is a story written by somebody who's fairly intelligent but just happens to be extremely racist, but no. Sax Rohmer, I don't know, is very unintelligent. You didn't come across it in this book. The whole book is just like China is just this mysterious entity that it just doesn't go into like why China and America are like intellectual opposites. It's just kind of the Chinese mind is savage and the American mind, the English mind is good. And I think in the introduction, there's even a part where it quotes Sax Rohmer as saying, like, I don't really know anything about China, which I find interminably dark and funny because he just wrote this whole series promoting so much hatred and so much yellow peril. And at the end of the day, it's like, I don't really know or care about any of this. I just did it. Just so darkly funny to me. Anyway, I didn't like it that much. Now this, ooh, what is this empty spot? Well, this empty spot represents Desolation Island by Patrick O'Brian, which I read because my grandpa said he likes Patrick O'Brian. So I just wanted to read a story of his and talk about it with him. And this was a good book. I mean, maybe it wasn't for me though. Maybe I should read more Patrick O'Brian. This book was very, I was wondering how much action there would be in it, and there wasn't really that much in this one, but it was cool. It was fun. What I noted was that it felt very, very realistic. Like the relationships between the characters aren't like typical novel characters. They're very realistic. The relationship that he has with his wife, especially in media, husband and wife relationships are usually very super romantic, like cupcake stage the whole time, or it's like very loveless. And this is clearly a middle ground where they're very used to each other, but there's still love there. And the things the characters say too are very realistic. There's a lot of allusions and a lot of funny words. And I think Patrick O'Brian did that on purpose, like playing around with the language, putting in kind of funny words that might entertain the reader to look them up, but at the same time are very realistic to the setting. They're not forced in at all. And that's what I like the best about it. So, as a replacement for Marryat, there wasn't much adventure in there. So maybe it's not a replacement for Marryat for me, but maybe there are more with more adventure in them and I can read those. That female spy character, I really liked her though. This next book is definitely going in the opposite direction in terms of realism. This is cheesy as hell. This is The Island of Captain Sparrow by S. Fowler Wright. And well, it's very weird. It's a book about a guy. He goes to an island in the South Seas. He finds that there's a naked lady, and then there's a bunch of satyrs who try to act lecherously upon her. But then he saves her from them, and then the naked lady becomes his friend, and then she goes and gets some clothes so she can't be naked lady anymore, and then she gets captured, and then he has to go save her from this race of people that came here in like the 1700s, and since then have started to attain satyr-like characteristics, because the satyrs are just a race that live there on the island naturally. These human beings come, also settle on the island, and the narrative explains that they start to grow horns and hooves and stuff, and maybe it's because they started fucking the satyrs, but it's equally possible that the satyrs so terrified the women that they just started giving birth to babies with horns. Makes sense to me. Anyway, this story is cheesy to the max. I gotta say, it felt like it was inspired by James Fenimore Cooper in the way that it was structured. It's it takes place over the course of a few days, and it's about one or two adventurous situations. Not that it's anywhere near as literarily great as James Fenimore Cooper, but it's definitely an adventure story. I think the big carnivorous birds were actually the funnest part of the story to me. But it was strange. It was one of those pulpy reads that you just pop down. I read it in like 2 days, I think, 2 or 3 days, which is really fast for me. Next book is All My Sins Remembered by Joe Haldeman. I read this book because I read The Forever War and I loved it. This book is a little different. I feel like this could be a fix-up novel. I don't actually know. But it's about a guy who he's this young Buddhist who joins the Peace Corps, or this like peace association, and they make him an assassin, which he has misgivings about because he believes in peace and pacifism, and that's why he joined the organization. But they assure him, they say, no, you'll be killing Hitler, that kind of thing. And he's begrudgingly says, well, okay. And then they give him this strange technology, which like called plastiflesh, which like basically makes him look like anybody. So throughout each of the stories in this book, he's posing as different people, and he's actually hypnotized into believing that he is those people, with like a little bit of what's really going on in the back of his mind, so he could be basically the ultimate spy. And what he discovers throughout the course of this book, not to give away the ending, but basically he slowly discovers that he's actually a tool being used for evil rather than a peace-loving person. I feel like that could have been gone into a bit more. Like his first few assignments, I feel like I didn't really see many of the sins going on. But by the end of the book, it's really sad. It's really powerful. It's very Joe Haldeman, very like the military is controlling you, very Vietnam War veteran sort of mentality. And that's what makes Joe Haldeman interesting. And that's what makes this book interesting too. I don't mean that looking at it from the lens of like his historical context of Vietnam War is what makes it interesting, because I hate that shit. I don't really care about like the only reason books are good is because of historical context or the author's life or whatever. I don't care about that. But this book is interesting because of the themes that Joe Haldeman imported to it from his life. And that's all I have to say. The next book is another science fiction novel, and it's our penultimate story on this wacky, wild adventure, and it's called The Great Explosion by Eric Frank Russell. I bought this book at Vaughn's Books in West Lafayette, Indiana, which I, live near. And this is a book about, it's got kind of a cool setup. Basically, humanity has discovered space travel. So the second they discover space travel, tons of sects, like all the weird people of society, just who don't really fit in, just hop into planes and just shoot off into the stars, go find random planets. And then humanity never really hears of them again, until one day they decide to create a cosmic empire because they've suddenly started panicking about what if there's aliens. And then they start contacting all these planets and trying to get them to help them. And first contact with these planets for 1,000 years or something like that. And now they're trying to just going around understanding what's going on with these planets and see how they've developed. And they find that they don't really get along with or understand these people. Like there's a nudist planet that values like your body and physical health and stuff. And they don't really care anything for the humans, the Terrans, like superior technology. There's a feudal planet, which doesn't have a central government, so they can't really enlist it for help. And then there's a planet that's just a libertarian fantasy, which is basically what this book is about. It's just another stupid libertarian fantasy science fiction book where the society is like, oh, well, that wouldn't work if you think about it for 2 seconds. Basically, it's an anarchy libertarian thing where the only currency is favors. People just do each other favors. Nobody's trained in anything. Nobody has a profession. Nobody goes to school for something. They just build a house for somebody as a favor for them building their house. And I'm sure that's a great way to get a bunch of well-built houses. You know what I mean? Like, okay, you live in an apartment complex. After 10 years, something's going to go wrong structurally, maybe. But you're not going to know that because you're not trained. Somebody else has to know. But how do you get somebody else to do it? You need somebody who's just does it randomly. You need to motivate them to do that. It can't just be of a favor. So you can't just get somebody to check your apartment's complicated architectural structure that you know nothing about just as a favor, and then you do something else for them. You need people with training that do things every once in a while for money, for an exchange. Also, on this favor-based currency system, how does parenthood work? Like, does a child owe their parent infinite obs, which is what this book says? Ob means obligation. It's a favor. Does a child owe a parent infinite obs, or is the debt wiped clean? When a husband and wife get together, do they owe each other obs? Like, how deep does the obs system go? I just don't understand how this book works. There's no central government, yet everybody has houses, and this is a thriving planet. And it just sounds really stupid. It's just one of those stupid libertarian fantasies. And not that libertarians are all stupid, just that this is a sci-fi novel where a guy had a nugget of an idea and it doesn't really make sense, and he doesn't really dive into it, but he just wants to tell you about it, which is kind of annoying. Can kind of feel like somebody who's high who just has an idea and they want to share it with you. Anyway, I went way over time, but that's my rant. At the end of the book, all the guys in the spaceship defect to this planet. Yeah, that's basically what happens. They leave the ship, they defect to this planet. They're like, we don't want to listen to these stupid fat guys in the ship anymore. They're fat, they're ugly, they're unhealthy, they're unhelpful. I don't want to listen to authority anymore, and I just want to live on obs for the rest of my life, live in this libertarian paradise. Yeah, kind of an interesting read. These old science fiction novels are fun to read. It was fun to read. I sound like I really hated it, but I didn't really. It's just that one aspect really bugs me. Really makes me feel like really just shows like a little bit of maybe not laziness, but maybe like rushedness, just a little bit of potential that either wasn't lived up to or just wasn't fully developed, which is always annoying in these kinds of stories. Anyway, the last book that I read this summer, and when I say summer, I define as leaving college and going back to college. So this story finished right before I went back to college, is Joyleg by Ward Moore. I read the story because Ward Moore wrote Bring the Jubilee, which is an excellent novel. And this one's also pretty excellent. Well, it's by Ward Moore and Avram Davidson, but it does feel pretty Ward Moore-y. Just like Bring the Jubilee is very historically literate, although of course it's more historically literate than Bring the Jubilee because it's actually about real history, not alternate history. And like Bring the Jubilee, it has a little bit of commentary in it too. It's about the modern day of like 1965 America. Some senator discovers that there's actually a man living in the state of Franklin, which is a state that was proposed to exist but never really existed. It's somewhere in like Kentucky, who is a Revolutionary War veteran. He's like 300 years old, and that's amazing. And somehow he's able to live by like bathing himself in this special moonshine mixture, and they get him on TV and they show him off, and it's the 24-hour news cycle, and he enchants the nation with the spirit of 76, and everybody loves Joyleg. But then eventually they start to discover that Joyleg isn't quite what they thought he was. It's actually a little more complicated. He isn't, people think, wow, he's some patriot who worked under George Washington, who gave his life for our country. He didn't die, but he put it on the line for our country. And they find out it's not really quite as simple as that. He was more of a freebooter, a buccaneer, sort of an anarchist almost, just this crazy hick. And it always talks about his part in the Whiskey Rebellion, and people just that is very interesting. This guy's life is very interesting in this story. I almost would like a book that's just his life, and it's not even like this science fiction novel. And then, after all that happens, he gets canceled because people find out he actually had relations with Benedict Arnold's daughter, and they start to question his loyalty. Like, is he actually loyal to America? Was he actually a British spy? And it's sort of commentary not only on like the birth of America and what America is built on, but also the 24-hour news cycle in general. And it's very well done. It's very interesting. I was very engaged with it. I would say that this book maybe could have been more of a novella than it already is a novella, but maybe it could have been a little bit shorter, like 80 to like 75 to 100 pages instead of 150. Maybe 150 is even stretching it a little far. But it was very well done. And that's all I have to say. I really like Joy. Like, let's zoom back out here to just have another telescopic view of what we've looked at here. And remember, this empty space is Desolation Island by Patrick O'Brian. What books did I like the most? Well, I haven't thought that much about it. Masterpieces of Science Fiction. I love that book the whole way through, and it's like 500, 600 pages. So maybe that kind of wins by default. It was the most stories that I liked the most that I read for a long time. But I love Martin Hewitt. And it might be between those two, actually. Joyleg I really liked. So those were the best stories that I read. I had a really good reading summer. I think it was very fun. I mean, of course, there are a lot of books that I didn't get to. There's some books here that I was met on, of course. There's always books that you're met on, especially when you read the kind of stuff that I do. These aren't exactly classics. There aren't very many classics here. I think the closest thing to a classic is probably The Spy, and then, or maybe Midshipman Easy. I'm not actually sure if Mr. Midshipman Easy has a Penguin edition. It's gotta. The Spy does. Anyway, that's just a lightning round. I think I'm about done talking. And see you next time, BookTube.